Despite growing racial disharmony, the U.S. was a fairly self-satisfied place in the 1950s. Then on October 4th, 1957, the world learned that the Soviet Union had successfully launched a 184-pound satellite into Earth orbit. Called Sputnik 1, its radio transmitter emitted nothing more than beeps, but it sent shock waves through the United States. That launch began a space race in which the United States came in dead second in the early years. The Soviets put a man, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, into orbit 4 years after Sputnik and 1 month before American astronaut Alan B. Shepard was launched on a 15-minute flight on May 5th, 1963. And astronauts are going to become like the rock stars of the 1960s as we now move into the 1960s. And space will really dominate our culture. John Kennedy will propose getting a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and this will happen in 1969 when Neil Armstrong lands and becomes the first man to walk on the moon. So astronauts are a big deal. The space race is a very real thing going on in the late 1950s, 1960s. A lot of money is going to be diverted to that because there was a real fear that the Soviets were ahead of us and that if they could really get into space and start dominating that, then we would be in a very fearful place of not knowing when an attack might come from space. So there was a real push for this. And that fear was real as the election of 1960 arrived. The candidates were Richard Nixon, who was Republican. He had been vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and John Kennedy, who was representing the Democratic Party. The election was very close, with most scholars believing that the televised debates turned the election in Kennedy's favor, and he will become the first Roman Catholic U.S. president. Kennedy came from a very powerful, a very wealthy family, and he was the definite underdog in this election because of his religion. There was a great deal of prejudice against Roman Catholics at that time, and a lot of people were very concerned about having a person become president who was Catholic because they thought he would put the wishes of the Pope over the wishes of the United States. And so there was a great deal of prejudice, great deal of concern, and he had to overcome that. They decided on the television debates. Television was a new medium now that is becoming more popular. Television is now going to begin to play a significant role in elections. Kennedy was wealthy. He shows up at this election. He's got a $100 haircut. He has a nice suit. He's all tanned. He looks really good, and a lot of people thought he was extremely handsome. And then you have Richard Nixon, who had been ill, who had just come out of the hospital. He had lost weight. His suit didn't fit properly. They put makeup on him to try to make him look better under the lights. The lights are very hot. That makeup starts running, and so he does not look good on television. A lot of people who just listened to the debates on the radio really kind of gave the winner to Nixon, thought that he did better, but those who watched the televised debates, they definitely went for Kennedy. At 43, Kennedy was the youngest elected president in American history. His administration established the Peace Corps, an organization of volunteers assigned to work in developing nations, created the Alliance for Progress, which strengthened relations with Latin America, and set a national goal, as I mentioned, of landing an American on the moon before the end of the 1960s. Although he was adored by many, Kennedy never succeeded in winning the support of Congress. Early in Kennedy's administration, the nation suffered the tragic humiliation of a bungled attempt to invade Cuba, which was under the communist rule of Fidel Castro. In March 1960, Eisenhower had approved a CIA plan to train anti-Castro Cuban exiles for an invasion to overthrow the Cuban leader. Kennedy allowed the preparations to continue, and some 1,500 exiles landed on April 17, 1961, at the Bay of Pigs on the island's southwestern coast. The result was a disaster. Not only had the attack secrecy been breached, but Kennedy, fearing Soviet reprisal, decided not to authorize promised U.S. air support. Worse, the CIA had badly misread the political climate of revolutionary Cuba. The general uprising the CIA believed would be set off by the landing simply did not happen. By April 19th, the invasion was crushed, and the 1,200 survivors were captured. They were released in December 1962 in exchange for $53 million worth of U.S. medicines and provisions. The Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw the failure of the Bay of Pigs as a sign of the new administration's weakness. Khrushchev quickly rushed in to exploit this flaw by covertly sending nuclear-armed missiles to Cuba, plus the technical and military personnel to install and operate them. An American U-2 plane photographed the missile bases under construction, and on October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the nation on television, announcing a naval blockade of the island. Kennedy demanded that the Soviets withdraw the missiles, and on October 24th, the blockade was in place. Now, he called it a quarantine because technically, under international law, if you blockade a nation, that's basically an act of war. So he's not going to use the term blockade. He's going to say that the island is being quarantined. And he essentially kind of draws an invisible line in the middle of the ocean and tells the Soviets that if you cross this with ships, with more missiles, with more personnel to get those missiles in operation, then we're going to go to war. So it's basically, it's up to you guys. For the next 4 days, Americans braced themselves for what might happen. On October 28th, Khrushchev backed down, offering to remove the missiles under UN supervision. For his part, Kennedy pledged never again to attempt to invade Cuba, and he also removed U.S. ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, from Turkish bases near the Soviet border. On October 29th, the blockade was lifted, and Kennedy had scored a signal victory. John Kennedy will be assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963, by Lee Harvey Oswald, who will then in turn also be shot and killed by a man named Jack Ruby. Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, will become president. When Johnson ran for president in his own right in 1964, he called upon America to build a great society, one that rests on abundance and liberty for all. The phrase became the label for an ambitious, idealistic package of legislation, including Medicare, which helped finance medical care for Americans over 65. Of all the creations of the Great Society, none had more profound implications than the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act banned segregation and discrimination in public accommodations such as restaurants, theaters, and hotels, and it barred employers from discriminatory hiring practices based on race. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was followed the next year by a Voting Rights Act, which destroyed the last pieces of local legislation intended to prevent or discourage African Americans from voting. In 1968, at the end of the Johnson years, another Civil Rights Act rendered discrimination by landlords and realtors illegal. Now, after Montgomery and the boycott that had gone on there, Martin Luther King Jr. lectured nationally and became president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He conducted major voter registration drives, demonstrations, marches, and campaigns. In August 1963, King organized a massive march on Washington where he delivered one of the great speeches in American history declaring, "I have a dream." In 1964, King was internationally recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize. He organized a voter registration drive in Selma, Alabama, leading a march from Selma to Montgomery in March 1965, which was met by angry white mobs. King expanded the civil rights movement into the South and began to attack not just legal and social injustice, but economic inequality. He was really a phenomenal leader for the movement. He really got it going, got the civil rights movement organized, and got a lot of people involved in it. Now, his big push is going to be nonviolence. He is going to train the people in this movement to deal with being insulted, to deal with being punched and attacked, and to not fight back. He said that the vast majority of the people in the United States were good, people, and that if they saw that happening on their television sets in their homes, that it would so horrify them that they would begin to come around to the civil rights movement and to what it was proposing. And he's ultimately going to be right, because people watching these young African American students being attacked by dogs and beaten by police officers just simply because they wanted to vote really began to hit home for people and began to make people take notice of what King was talking about. Now, there are going to be those in the civil rights movement that are going to get tired of waiting around. They're going to get tired of the nonviolent movement. You're going to have the Black Power movement develop. Malcolm X will be one who will not be supportive of what King says initially. Eventually, they will kind of come together, and then Malcolm King is going to be shot and killed. And so you're going to have a split in the movement, but non-violence is going to be a big push that King really advocates. King flies to Memphis, Tennessee to support striking sanitation workers, and in that city on April 4th, 1968, he is going to be assassinated by James Earl Ray. The assassination of Dr. King sparked urban riots across a number of the nation's black ghettos. Despite his nonviolent message, racial unrest had often turned violent. NAACP leader Medgar Evers was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963. In Birmingham, Alabama on September 15, 1963, that was the scene of the bombing of a black church in which 4 girls were killed. 3 civil rights activists, including 2 white activists, were killed in Mississippi while working to register black voters in 1964. On August 11, 1963, a 6-day riot ripped apart the Watts section of Los Angeles after a police patrolman attempted to arrest a man for drunk driving. Riots broke out the following summer in New York and Chicago, and in 1967 in Newark and Detroit. Following the King assassination in 1968, more than 100 cities erupted into violence. The decade was a very violent decade for us, and another reason for the violence that was going on was because of the Vietnam War. And we'll talk about that in the next session.